Hello and welcome to the Meet the Parents podcast.
Hello and welcome to episode 71 of the Meet the Parents podcast and another half an hour of parenting-based chat. I'm Tim from Slouching Towards Thatcham, and tonight I'm joined by Mark from Best Dad I Can Be. Good evening, Mark.
Hi, Tim, and a slightly croaky Tim that I'm talking to this evening.
Yeah, slightly. We'll see how long I last. So, this week we're going to talk about the dilemma of sharenting content of our kids. Here on the Meet the Parents podcast, we like to talk about all the exciting stuff that's on the tip of everyone's tongues. So instead of talking about stormophilia or discussing the Harvey Weinstein scandal, we're going to talk about the new data protection bill that was being debated in Parliament last week. I know, it's thrilling, edge-of-your-seat stuff, isn't it? But actually, there are some important implications here for all parents, in particular those who share images and stories relating to their kids via social media and in other places online, such as blogs. Now, ultimately, this new legislation may impact children's rights to demand the removal of photos from their parents' social media accounts, even several years after the fact. Now, being sensitive to our children's feelings and right to privacy in what we publish on our blogs is something I know Mark and I have discussed before, but I think it's worth revisiting this in the light of the bill and a recent post I read on the London School of Economics Parenting for a Digital Future blog. Oh, the research I do for this podcast. So, Mark, let's kick off this discussion with a little bit of data. Now, the average parent shares almost 1,500 images of their child online before their 5th birthday. So that's basically 6 pictures a week. And more than 80% of children have an online presence by the age of 2. So do those numbers surprise or worry you in any way?
They don't surprise me. They absolutely astonish me. I suppose the fact that my children are older, and I started writing about my children 14 years ago, and at that time, Alex, the youngest, was 4 years old. So at that time, Instagram and Twitter didn't exist, and therefore I was writing, and that's all I did. I didn't share images at all. So when you sent those figures to me before we started talking, I did the same maths that you've done, and I was astonished. I was astonished. But I suppose, in those days, 14 years ago, what mobile phone did I have? I probably had a Nokia 1, which didn't really take photographs. I certainly, as an individual, take far more photographs now than I ever used to. So I suppose that's natural for parents. But even so, to be sharing 6 images of your children a week, I think is a lot.
Certainly for some of us, particularly bloggers or anyone who's particularly active on Instagram, you're sharing a lot more than just 6 photos a week. I know there are bloggers who will quite happily share 6 or more photos of their children a day. And, what you say about how mobile phone technology has come along so much in the 14 years since you started writing about your children is absolutely true. I think it's really easy for us to forget how quickly social media has taken over our lives, facilitated by improvements in smartphone technology, access to high-speed broadband and so on. I mean, I still remember when I started blogging, not quite as long ago as you, but 10, 11 years ago, it was still relatively quite a big thing to even upload a photo onto a blog if you were doing it via a dial-up modem without access to broadband.
Sure. I mean, it still astonishes me that I can take a photo, couple of clicks, I share it to a group, I try and put a witty little commentary with it, and the job's done, isn't it? But I posted a really nice photo of a sunrise over the weekend. you get maybe a couple of hundred likes. You can understand why people do it, because you're getting, I'm sure it's releasing a little bit of endorphin or whatever the relevant chemical is every time somebody likes your photo. I can absolutely understand why people do it, and find it an almost addictive process.
Yeah, I mean, there's a large degree of validation and an ego stroking, isn't there, that's involved in, as you say, when every time someone likes your photo.
Yeah, I'm sure many people are like me, that I considered myself a fairly poor photographer. You know, in the old days of when cameras existed, I would work on the principle that if I took 20 photographs, one of them would be okay. Whereas now, you know, you can take photographs, you do a burst on your iPhone. There are 101 different editing apps, which even now I'm starting to learn, but I'm not hugely expert with. And you can produce really good photographs.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, you go back 14 years to when you started writing about the kids, and that was about the time when digital cameras started to really come into the mainstream and surpass what you could do with an ordinary film camera. And I mean, I grew up with film cameras. Back in those days, you would have to pay for a roll of film that had 24 or 36 exposures on, so there was a cost involved in that. You then were very sparing about which photos you took, because you knew there was a cost associated with the film and then with developing it, and then you had to go through the whole rigmarole of taking it to Boots or anywhere else that would develop your photos, wait a couple of days for them to return, and then discover that you'd only had one decent photo on the entire film. And that's completely different to how we are nowadays, where, as you say, you can take your phone out of your pocket, you can take 100 photos in a burst if you like, and delete 99 of them, and there's no cost associated with it. And that's been in many ways very liberating, and that's what's really enabled the ability for us to share photos via apps such as, or social platforms such as Twitter or Instagram. And Instagram is only 7 years old. This is it's now become almost ubiquitous in our lives. If you have an online social media presence, Instagram has 800 million users online and something like 500 million who use the app daily. And that's the extent to which imagery has taken over our lives now, and it's almost replaced conversation in a way, in terms of how we communicate with friends and family.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you talk about the research you did. I mean, I did some work for one of my clients on the significant proportion of millennials who would rather communicate by image and by emoji than by using words, written words. And the figure was around 25%, which was astonishing to me. People want to see photographs. They want to use emojis. They want to communicate in a quick and easy form.
Yeah, no, that's right. And going back to those numbers, 1,500 images being shared before a child's 5th birthday, 80% plus having an online presence by the age of 2. Am I surprised by those numbers? Not at all, really. And in fact, I dread to think what those numbers would be if you only looked at bloggers. It's no wonder that some people have concerns about parental oversharing, parents sharing too much of their kids' lives in a way that's inappropriate, either now or potentially in the future. And could, in extreme cases, potentially compromise their safety. I mean, all those photos of your 3-year-old son trying on dresses that seemed so cute at the time, but could obviously cause them embarrassment, or maybe even become the subject of teasing in later life. And it's one thing rolling out embarrassing photos for their wedding reception, and I've got plenty of those stored away, but what about if they become the topic of conversation in the school playground? And that's the challenge for us, isn't it? Where do we draw the line to prevent embarrassment and preserve their own right to privacy?
I think that is absolutely the challenge. And it's something that I've always done when I've been writing about the kids, is that when your child is 2 or 3, they don't know what you're writing and they don't have an opinion. By the time your child is 12 or 13, they do know what you're writing. and they most certainly do have an opinion about what you're writing. So if you are to continue doing it, you have to take your children along with you. And yeah, I mean, this is something I say all the time, but you've got to have a dialogue with your children and say, this is what I'm doing. And you are now at the stage where you have the absolute right to say, no, I don't want that picture using.
Yeah, and actually that conversation can start at a relatively early age. I know with Isaac, he's nearly 10 now, but we've been having conversations for at least 18 months now about, he knows about the blog, he occasionally reads it, we often have conversations about photos that I take of him, and he'll check, are you thinking about publishing that on the blog? And a lot of the times, absolutely I won't. But sometimes one will come up and we'll have the discussion about whether it's something he feels comfortable with. And if he doesn't feel comfortable with it, I absolutely won't publish it.
So, for example, he wouldn't feel comfortable about being seen in an Arsenal shirt, for example, Tim.
Not at the moment, no. To be fair, I'm not overly comfortable being seen in an Arsenal shirt at the moment. I know in the past that you and I have spoken about the example of one of your sons and also your daughter coming home drunk for the first time.
Yeah.
And that's a really good example, I think, as well, of it's not just images, it's words. Where do you draw the line between something you would publish?
I mean, just to expand on that one, the first time Dan came home drunk, I did write about it because it was very funny, and it also answered a question. Essentially, men are either fighting drunks or they're sentimental drunks, and it's quite an important difference. Dan turned out, thankfully, to be a sentimental drunk, and it was very funny. And the whole the point of the story really at the end was that I was quite jealous that he'd been horribly drunk and the next day didn't have a hangover at all, which of course is one of the things you can do when you're young. There were never any photographs of that, but there are most certainly words. The first time Eleanor got drunk, that was a fairly horrendous experience, and I never wrote about that, and I never will, because that was clearly just something that A, I didn't want to write about, and B, I realised that she would have been very unhappy with me writing about it at the time, and I think probably now she wouldn't want to be reminded of it. That one never saw the light of day, and I think that's an important line that parents have to draw for themselves.
In all your time writing about the kids, have you found that where you've drawn the line has shifted as they've gotten older?
I think, interestingly, the short answer to that is yes. But now they are older and they have more of a grasp of the overall picture that the blog is providing, the whole span of their childhood. They now give me more license to write about things than they would when they were perhaps 17 or 18. Let me give you an example of that. Dan was home from university for about a month ago, and he said one evening, he said, I'm going out. And we said, where are you going? Are you going up to the pub to see your friends? And he said, no, I'm going out. I've got a date. I said, there's no one at home that you know, none of your old friends from school. He said, I've got a date off Tinder. Of course, there's a bit of explaining to Dad exactly how Tinder works,
Swipe right, swipe left.
Swipe right, yeah, I understand that now. The next day when I came downstairs in the morning, there was a pair of black heels in the hall, which weren't my wife's and they weren't my daughter's either. I did actually write about that. It's the one I've written for this week. I'll send it to you. And I said to Dan, "Are you okay with this?" I obviously didn't mention the girl involved by name or anything like that. I said, "Are you okay with this?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm absolutely fine with it." Yeah, I think it's quite interesting because, as with all my stuff, the end result is that the joke is on me because they were talking about what sort of profile I'd have if I had a Tinder profile, which, clearly would be a fair amount of people in hospital with RSI with swiping left. Had that incident happened 3 or 4 years ago, there's no way he would have let me write about it. but now he's got the confidence to see that it's just an episode in life. And as with Dan, there are certain boundaries that I won't cross. And I think providing you have that discussion with your children all the time, then they will respect the fact that you are writing, and they will be confident that you will draw the line. And if I ever have any doubts, I just send the relevant blog post to the relevant child and say, are you okay with this?
In the blogging world, and particularly amongst parents of younger children, where you draw the line is a subject that's much discussed and debated. Now, some bloggers anonymise their children's names and may even be deliberately vague about where they live. Others never show their kids' faces, something which I think also reflects a growing concern with people who steal images off the internet and pass them off as their own, which is something I've never understood the motivation behind, but it absolutely does happen. And you get blurring out of school logos on children's uniforms, all this kind of stuff. And and it really does make you think about where you should draw the lines. And I will hold my hands up here. There are certainly posts or images that I've published in the past where, with hindsight, as the kids have gotten older, I've considered editing them down or even removing them altogether with the benefit of hindsight. And I haven't done it yet, but it's definitely in my mind, particularly now that I'm having more and more of those conversations, with Isaac. He is nearly 10. I'm mindful that he's becoming more self-conscious, and he's definitely savvy about the potential dangers and pitfalls of his online footprint. Going back to numbers, for me, I definitely don't think the issue is so much how much we share as what and where. Plastering every image of our kids running around the garden in only their underwear publicly all over Facebook is very different from sharing an album of family holiday photos via a restricted album or via closed groups using the likes of WhatsApp or similar. And then there's the matter of sharing images of other people's kids. This is something I think bloggers in particular are extremely conscious of, but perhaps not all parents are. Now, whenever I go to events at our school, they're always reminding people of this. Taking photos for private use and storage is one thing, but taking photos of 20 kids on the stage and then publishing it to Facebook without the express permission from every parent of every child in the photo is an absolute no-no. And I certainly won't do it without cropping out other children from the picture, or at the very least blurring their faces in Photoshop. And yet I regularly see photos on Facebook or Instagram where someone has published a photo of a group of a dozen kids, and they clearly haven't obtained permission to share it.
No, I mean that's an impossible thing to do, I would think.
Is this a problem that you've ever encountered?
No, it isn't, because when I guess I'm fortunate in that respect, in that because my kids are older, they went through that school plays era before this became a problem, and also because the style of my blog has always been the written word rather than the photographs. It's not been a huge problem for me, but goodness me, if you were starting now in a photograph-dominated world, then it really is, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, and these days, if I go to a school nativity play or something similar, there's a mad scramble to get to the front, where you can obviously get an unobstructed view. If you stand at the back and watch, it's really... I don't know, actually, whether it's funny or whether it's quite unnerving, because essentially every parent in that room, myself included, will be standing there with a camera out or their phone out, either taking photos or videoing the whole thing. And sometimes I think we're almost not there to watch a nativity play or a concert, but merely to document it.
Yeah, that was something that I always tried to do with... I didn't want to watch nativity plays through a camera. I always wanted to be a normal person watching a normal nativity play and just try and hold the image in my mind, as opposed to taking 1,000 photos. we would always take photos afterwards. In fact, I can't remember. I think the school actually actively discouraged the taking of photographs during the play, which I think is probably not a bad rule. They used to have one person doing an official video, which you could then buy. Other than that, they tried to discourage it.
Yeah, and I guess it's difficult these days because people do want to record photos either for themselves or, in some cases to share on social media. And I guess that's one of the challenges these days with the proliferation of social media channels. I mean, privacy in particular is now a bigger challenge than ever. I mean, it's almost impossible not to leave a digital footprint these days, whether it's your own or as part of someone else's footprint, which isn't then within your control, and you may not even be aware of it. And I know in tech community circles, the right to be forgotten has been a real hot topic. It's much more difficult to erase your digital footprint than you might at worst think, and it's all a bit Orwellian, isn't it? Someone somewhere can always see what you're doing.
Absolutely. Yeah, what did we watch the other night? The Circle, which is the one with Emma Watson in, where, essentially surveillance is just all encompassing. I mean, you think in the real world, if Facebook and Amazon were ever to merge, how much information would they have on our lives?
Yeah, and it's scary how much the information the likes of Facebook do have. In many ways, they know us better than we know ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that frightens me, is that you look at something online that you're moderately interested in, and within 10 seconds, ads for it are stalking you around the internet, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. The law is actually quite vague when it comes to privacy and the protection of individuals and children. It's not entirely clear at this stage whether a child can demand images of themselves being removed, even from their parents' social media accounts. Now, the way the law sees it, as I understand it, there has to be a balance between the child's right to privacy versus the parent's own rights. But in theory, you could have a situation where a child could sue their own parents and get a takedown order issued. Although, obviously, you'd have to hope it doesn't get quite that far. But what do you think? Should kids have that right? And, should the law be less ambiguous than it appears to be at the moment?
It's incredibly difficult, isn't it? Because what's happening now is that the technology is moving far faster than the law can move. Should kids have that right? Well, what's the difference between an image on Facebook, on social media, and an image that's just held in an old photograph? I think it's a really, really difficult area, Tim, because you start saying, where do you draw the line? Does, potentially can a child turn round to their parents, and let's face it, teenagers do occasionally fall out with their parents.
No, never.
Does the child turn round at 18 years and one day and say, I demand that every photograph you've ever taken of me be deleted?
It's difficult, isn't it? I mean, especially while the law is so vague. And it may well be that things do start to become a little bit clearer going forward. The new General Data Protection Regulation places much greater emphasis on children's rights. So we may see some greater clarity coming out of that when it becomes enforced next year. And also in the Queen's speech, the government promised that it would use a new Data Protection Act to give people new rights to require major social media platforms to delete information held about them at the age of 18. So, that example you gave, that could very easily become real. And it's, from a legal standpoint and from a parenting standpoint, this is something that is potentially game-changing for those of us who have been liberally sharing photos and stories of our kids since they were born. So I guess just as a final point, let's put the law to one side, because neither you nor I are legal experts. But before any new legislation kicks in, what should we as parents be doing to protect our children's privacy? Any thoughts?
I think that the obvious answer is that you've got to be incredibly careful about the images that you share. But I think there are two angles to this. One is public. So what images am I going to share of my children and make available for public consumption? But there's also a private one as well, or a within the family argument. What images am I going to share and what am I going to write about my children? Because we've got to preserve the family going forward. And as you say, if you've shared every image you've ever taken of your child running around the garden wearing nothing at all, then the chances are you really should have thought that one through before you publish the images. But the thing that I would say over and over again is that if you are to retain a relationship with your children, then you've got to discuss with them what you're doing. Why are we going on this trip to Centre Parks, Dad? Well, we're going on it because someone else has paid for it. And the price we pay for that is that I have got to write about it and take some photographs. And I am going to show you the photographs that I've taken. And you're going to say, would you mind? That one is probably not what I would like my friends to see.
I can only agree 100%, I think, with what you've said. And I think it also definitely helps to be a bit more aware of the various privacy settings and options that are available on the different social networks, because they all have slightly different rules. And while there are some images that we may be perfectly happy to share publicly, maybe there are times when we want to share via a private group, via WhatsApp or something, rather than plastering it all over Facebook. So, as you've said a number of times, overall, I think the best solution has to be to talk to our kids about what they are and aren't comfortable with in terms of how they're presented online, especially as they get older. And it is incumbent on us to be mindful on their behalf of what we do before they get to the age where they can talk about it. And, if that means sometimes that we don't post that ever so cute funny photo of our toddler doing something amusing, then so be it. There's nothing to stop us keeping that photo for our own use.
You've just got to have an edit button on all the time. You really have. I don't know, you've made me think now. I shall have to go back and look at some of the things that I've written, particularly about my daughter, and ask her if she'd like some of them deleted. Would she, for example, like a potential employer to read the one where she completely loses her temper and throws a cheese sandwich at me? Probably not.
So on that note, I'm just going to go away and remove a load of photos of Isaac running around his bedroom in a dress and replace them with photos of me running around my bedroom in a dress, because at least I can't sue myself. So Mark, before we go, what have you been up to recently?
Well, all I've been doing really is pressing F5 on Amazon reports to see how the book's doing. So that's out now.
And as we were discussing before, you are now officially an international bestseller.
Well, yes, yes, I did get to number one in Canada, and I've been number one in the UK. So, but sadly, the numbers involved are relatively small in certain Amazon categories. So, the Ferrari will just have to wait, and there's no news thus far of the film rights being sold either. So, we'll just have to carry on with the day job for a while.
There's nothing wrong with being number one in a field of one.
No.
As for me, I've actually had a fairly uneventful week. Now, this is a rarity and a good thing, but we have had our usual busy weekend running kids all over the place. We spent quite a while at the weekend playing board games, both some new ones and some old favourites. And on Sunday we had a last barbecue of the season with neighbours in our street. Kids playing together outside, plenty of beer. What's not to like? And that's it for this episode of the Meet the Parents podcast. We'll be back next week, but in the meantime, here's where you can find the two of us online.
Yeah, on Twitter, I'm at bestdadicanbe, and the website for the new book is markrichards.co.uk.
And I'm at ThatchamDad, and you can find me at slouchingtowardsthatcham.com. So you can download this podcast on iTunes and Android devices, from our website at meettheparentspodcast.com, and via a variety of podcasting apps. And you can also follow us on Twitter at ParentsPodcast and Facebook at facebook.com/meettheparentspodcast. So thanks very much for listening, and do please join us again next week. Good night.